Hello, my name is Ian, and in this tutorial I want to share with you how I created the backrooms in Blender. And this will be like a part 1 where I show you how to do modeling, and if you're fairly new to Blender, this should be a good tutorial for you. Before we get too deep into it, if you're interested in learning more about visual effects in Blender, I've created a completely free video for you where I share the 5 techniques that will immediately make your visual effects seamless. So if that sounds interesting to you, there's a link in the description. You could probably pop that open in a new tab, but let's get started here. I'm going to go File and New, and I'm just going to start from scratch here. If we hit 1 on the numpad, that takes us into front view, and this cube here is about the size of a person, so I'm going to use this for reference and scale. I'm just going to grab it and hold down Control and snap it to the ground plane here. And speaking of planes, let's drop one of those in. I'm going to go Shift A and plane, and I'm just going to hit S and 10. That will scale it up 10 times. And actually, let's go a bit bigger here. I'm going to go S and 2, and that will scale it up twice as much. And if we think about this as the height of a person, if I just scale it down on everything but the Z-axis, yeah, that's about the size of our room here, and that should be good. Okay, cool. Now with this plane selected, I'm going to go Shift D and Z, and that will just bring it up on the vertical axis. And if we go 1 to get into front view and hit Z and go into wireframe, then we can kind of see what we're dealing with here. If that's the height of a person, that's the clearance of the roof. Maybe a little bit more. Here we go. All right, now let's rotate this by 180 degrees. So R 180, and that will just make sure that the normals are facing downwards rather than upwards. So these two planes can be acting like a floor and a ceiling. Now I don't think I need this cube anymore, so I'm gonna hit X and delete that. Let's also go Shift A and add in one more plane, and we'll use this for our walls. So I'm going to go R, Y, and 90 degrees to rotate that vertically. And once again from front view, and once again in wireframe view, we can see how this is going. Let's just grab it and bring it up on the Z axis by hitting G and Z. And then I'm going to scale this up once again with S, just to make sure that it's as tall as the ceiling and as low as the floor. And it looks like we don't have any gaps here, so that's looking pretty good. Now let's kind of work on the structure of our back rooms, and this is the part where we kind of turn it into a bit of a maze. So I'm going to hit 7 on the number pad to go to top view, and once again I'm just going to hit Z and hop into wireframe view. Let's grab this guy and move it over on the X axis to our far wall here, and then I'm going to hit Tab and go into edit mode where we edit this object. So I'm going to box select the top verts here, and I'm going to hit G. And if we hold down Control, that will snap it to the grid. So I'm just going to drag that over to the corner there. And let's drag the bottom part down to the bottom corner. Okay, cool. Before we go too crazy on this wall, there's one more thing that I want to add to the geometry. And going into solid view, we could see that a little bit better. If I go Control R, that will add in a loop cut. And if we just put our mouse along the edge here, that's the orientation I want. I'm going to hit left mouse button, and then just drag it down to the floor, and this is going to act kind of like our trim, and we'll extrude it a little bit later when we finish all of our walls. So now let's go back to our top view with 7 on the number pad, back into wireframe view, and I'm just going to select the bottom verts here and just go crazy. So I'm going to hit E, and that will extrude it. I'm going to hold down Control, and let's see, this should land us roughly in the corner here. You can hit G and X without holding Control to get more fine movement. That's pretty good there. And we could just completely box this in, but I kind of like to have an entrance and exit, so I'm going to go Shift D, and that will duplicate the vertices we have here. And then I'm going to constrain it to the Y axis by hitting Y, and that will just add a little bit of a gap there. So once again, back to our top view, I'm going to hit E to extrude it once more, and Y just to bring it up along the top here. Now this isn't exactly lined up with our other corner, just so I make sure to do that. I'm going to select both of them with the box select, and just for your information, I'm using X-ray view, so that's this little box up here, just to make sure that I select all of the vertices from the top down rather than just the top one that's visible. And now I'm going to hit S and Y and 0, and that will completely flatten them out and make sure they're at the same level. So if we once again select these and hit E and X, I can drag that over holding Control, and we've got our exit. Cool. So it's pretty close to a room now. Let's see if we can make things a little bit more confusing by adding some maze elements to it. Once again, from top view, let's grab this edge that we just created and go a little bit crazy here. So I'm going to hit E And once again, holding control just to make sure I get good angles, extrude out into the scene. And something like this is pretty disorienting, so I'll use that. There we go, just go into the edge here. And now we've got this chunk in our scene. That's looking pretty good. If we want, we could make things even more cluttered by box selecting all of this and then hitting Shift D. I'm going to duplicate that. I can just move it over here. Let's just rotate it a little bit. So I'm going to hit R. And once again, you can hit Control to make sure you've got exact rotations here. And this is looking pretty good and pretty disorienting. But you can see if I go into solid view, there's kind of a gap in this wall, which isn't very good modeling practice. So once again, from top view, I'm going to select all of this part of the gaps, and I'm going to use a shortcut to go into the edge menu, Control E. And then if we go bridge edge loops here, what that'll do is it'll really nicely fill in that hole for us. Okay, cool. So now the only thing we have left to do for the modeling side of this is the trim at the bottom of the walls. So if we go into face select up here, and I select all of the bottom edges, one way to do that is to hold down Alt and then just hit the corner here. And as you can see in wireframe view, that just selects all of the trim at the bottom. And we can do that with our big walls. This time we have to hold Shift because we're selecting more than one selection. So Alt, Shift, and left mouse button. You can see that gets all of that. And then one more for this wall, Alt, Shift, and there we go. Now with all of them selected, I'm going to hit I, and that will do an inset. And you can see if we move our mouse, that can get pretty crazy, but we don't want to move our mouse just yet. We want to hold down Control and then drag the mouse. And that provides us with a nice little trim here. That might be a little bit thick, so I'm going to go down to the panel down here, and let's just change the depth to be a little bit smaller. If you hold down Shift, you can have more fine control. And that looks pretty good, I think. Now, something that'll help us when we're doing materials is if we go Control and plus on the numpad to grow our selection, that'll select the top part of our trim. And if we just hop into the material tab really quick here, let's add 2 slots, one for everything, and then one for the trim. And I'm just going to hit Assign. And basically that means whatever goes in this material slot will only go on the trim here. Okay, so that is our modeling pretty much set here. Let's just do a few more things to set up our scene and make sure we're on the right track when we go to materials. So I'm going to get a nice camera view here. I think this will look pretty good. And I'm going to go Control, Alt, and 0 on the number pad, and that'll snap our active camera to our view. And if you want to adjust this a little bit more, you can go Shift F, and you can actually use WAS and D. Let's back this up a little bit, but not too much. Nice. Now with the camera set up, I want to show you a trick that is absolutely amazing. There's this add-on called Camera Shakify, which will give your camera completely realistic camera motion, and it's absolutely fantastic. And if you're going to be making an animation running through the backrooms, you definitely want to be using realistic camera motion. So what we're going to use is down here in the camera settings, you can see I have this block called Camera Shakify, and I'll leave links in the description on where you can find the add-on. Once you download the zip file, you can just go into Edit, Preferences, and if you hit the Install button up here, you can find your zip file, and then just type in Camera, and you can see here I've got Camera Shakify, and just make sure that checkbox is checked, and once you do that, you should have this little box down here in the camera settings. So what we can do is hit plus, and immediately it adds investigation. So if we play forward our animation here, you can see the camera is doing all sorts of crazy shaky stuff. This is a little bit extreme for what we want, so I'm going to turn down the influence to something very small. And now we've got some nice realistic camera animation. In addition to that, you can change the type of camera shake. So we could go something like Handycam Run, and if your character is running away from an entity or something like that, and we play it forward, you can see we've got the running animation. That's pretty good. Once again, if you turn off the influence, it gets to be way too much, so keep it subtle. Okay, cool. So that is our camera all set up and realistic. If we go up here into rendered view, you can see we are using the real-time engine Eevee, but nothing looks very good at the moment, and that's partially because our lamp is outside of our scene. So let's just grab that and drag it into the room real quick here. That's a good start. but this is a point lamp, and for the kind of fluorescent lights that we want, we're going to want an area lamp. So down here in the lamp settings, I'm going to switch this to area. And you can see the light has some rotation, so let's get rid of that with Alt-R. And let's make sure this light is in its own collection. So I'm going to hit M and new collection. And I'm just going to call this light. So that way, if we have a whole bunch of lights at any point, we can uncheck the scene collection and select our lights. Okay, let's look a little bit closer at this. I'm going to drag it up towards the ceiling, so there is probably good. And let's just make this a little bit bigger. Here it says rectangle, so I'm going to turn up the scale here, and then let's just make it a little bit longer on the y-axis. So now we have kind of a fluorescent light look here. Yeah, that's pretty good. Cool. Now what this light object is doing is just casting light. You can't actually see it in the render, so let's add something that we can see that looks like a light. I'm going to go Shift S and cursor to selected. That will drop our cursor right on the lamp there. And let's go Shift A and plane. And let's resize this plane to look about the same size. So S and X and S and Y. There we go. That's about the same size. And let's drag it up a little bit so it's not blocking the light or anything. There we go. Now let's actually make this look like a light. So in the material settings, I'm going to go new and switch principled to emission. And there we go. And we can turn this up to like a 5 or so. And that's looking pretty good. Very nice. Might be a little bit big even. So I'm going to select both of these holding Shift and scale it down. There we go. That's better. Now the last thing we're going to do in this tutorial is actually make this look a little bit better in the render settings. So let's go to the render properties here, and I'm going to enable bloom, which if we see this a little bit closer, actually renders pretty nicely. So that's a very good start. Another thing, let's just add in some ambient occlusion that will add shadows to the walls and in the corners. So let's just turn up the distance a little bit here. Somewhere around 2 meters is kind of what I like. Gives the corners a nice dark, creepy feel. And eventually we're going to want screen space reflections. But for now, let's just check motion blur. And now when the camera is moving around like crazy, that'll give us some good motion blur. Cool. So it doesn't look like much at the moment, but in the next lesson, when we work on materials, things will start really coming together. Now, like I mentioned, if you're interested in learning more about visual effects in Blender, definitely check out that guide in the description on the 5 techniques that'll immediately make your visual effects seamless. But other than that, maybe you're interested in learning how to create Siren Head in Blender. And if you are, I have created a playlist of tutorials that detail that whole process, which I will put right here.